The cold was a discipline. Elias Thorne understood it, respected its unyielding nature. It was a perfect mirror for the permafrost that had settled deep in his own soul. His cabin, perched on a granite shoulder of the Colorado Rockies, was less a home and more a forward operating base against the incursions of memory. Every morning began with the same rigid ceremony: 50 push-ups on the frozen floorboards, a face-numbing splash of water from the hand pump, and coffee, black and bitter, brewed with military precision. The logs in the woodpile were stacked with geometric perfection, the floors were swept clean of all but the most stubborn dust motes, and the single wool blanket on his cot was folded into a tight, unforgiving rectangle. It was an existence whittled down to its barest essentials, a life lived in the narrow space between duty and survival. He had once commanded teams of men who moved like shadows through the world's most dangerous places. Now, his only command was over the silence within these four walls. It was a silence he cultivated, a weapon he turned upon himself. It kept the ghost at bay, the ghost of Sarah, his wife, whose laughter used to echo off these same pine logs, and the ghost of Rex, his partner, a German shepherd whose loyalty had been written in blood on a dusty road half a world away. Their absence was a physical presence in the cabin. It sat in the empty chair across the hearth. It lived in the scent of lavender that still clung faintly to a scarf tucked away in a drawer. It haunted the worn leather collar that he kept in a locked footlocker, a relic too sacred to display and too painful to discard. Elias, former Navy SEAL, a man forged in pressure and fire, had retreated from the world to build a fortress, not of stone and timber, but of solitude and ice. The winter had been particularly brutal that year, draping the mountains in a shroud of impenetrable white. A blizzard had been raging for 2 days, a relentless assault of wind and snow that erased the familiar lines of the landscape. For Elias, it was just another variable to be managed. He was conducting a perimeter check, a habit ingrained from years of living on high alert. Dressed in tactical gear that had seen far harsher climates, he moved with a fluid economy of motion, his boots crunching a steady rhythm in the deep powder. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at his exposed skin, but he barely registered the bite. His internal winter was far colder. The mission was simple: ensure the integrity of his defenses, check the lines, and return to the sterile safety of his sanctuary. He was on the far edge of his property, near a jagged spine of rock that offered some meager protection from the gale, when he heard it. It was a sound so faint it was almost a trick of the wind, a thin, desperate whimper that snagged on the edge of his trained hearing. He stopped, head cocked, every nerve ending suddenly alight. His body reacted before his mind could object, dropping into a low crouch, scanning the whiteout. It was the sound of vulnerability, a crack in the monolithic indifference of the storm. It was a sound that did not belong here. Against every instinct for self-preservation he had so carefully cultivated, he moved toward it. He found them huddled in the lee of a massive fallen spruce, its roots clawed from the earth like the hand of a dying giant. A female German shepherd lay curled into a tight ball, her own body a desperate, living shield against the storm. Tucked beneath her, nestled into the hollow of her stomach, were 2 impossibly small puppies. The mother dog was a portrait of noble suffering. Her fur was matted with ice, and a deep tremor ran through her gaunt frame. But it was her eyes that seized him. They were a pale, cloudy blue, like a frozen sky, and they were utterly vacant. They did not track his movement. As he knelt closer, the wind whipping his hair across his face, he realized with a jolt that she was blind. She lifted her head, her black nose twitching, tasting the air, catching his scent. A low rumble started in her chest, but it was not a growl of aggression. It was a sound of profound fear and exhaustion. One of the puppies, a brave little male with paws too big for his body, let out a defiant yip, a comical challenge to the giant shape looming over them. The other, a smaller female, simply burrowed deeper into her mother's thin coat, a trembling ball of black and tan fur. Elias looked at the mother, at this creature fighting a battle she could not win, in a world of total darkness, and something inside his frozen heart cracked. He saw not an animal, but a soldier holding the line against impossible odds. He saw a mother protecting her children. He saw a flicker of the same unwavering loyalty he had seen in Rex's eyes just before the end. The mission parameters changed. There was no room for debate, no time for the cold logic that had governed his life for the past 2 years. There was only the immediate, undeniable imperative of action. The blizzard was a living entity, its fury intensifying with each passing moment, and the fragile spark of life in this small, desperate family was threatening to be extinguished. Elias shrugged off his heavy outer pack, his movements swift and sure. He unzipped his insulated parka, the wind immediately sinking its teeth into the layers beneath. A sharp and unwelcome shock. He ignored it. He carefully, gently scooped up the two puppies. They were weightless, their tiny bodies radiating a surprising warmth against his frozen fingers. The bold one squirmed, letting out another series of high-pitched barks, while the quiet one went rigid with fear. He tucked them inside his parka, zipping it up to his chin, creating a warm, dark cavern against his chest. Their frantic heartbeats were a drum against his own. The mother, Grace, as he had already named her in his mind, had grown agitated, sensing her pups were gone. She whined, a heartbreaking sound of confusion and loss, trying to stand on legs that trembled with weakness and cold. "Easy, girl," Elias murmured, his voice a low rumble, the same tone he had used to soothe Rex during the thunder of mortar fire. "I've got them. We're getting out of here." He reached into his pack and retrieved a length of climbing rope. He fashioned a makeshift slip lead, his fingers numb but unerring in their task. He approached her slowly, letting her smell his outstretched hand before gently looping the rope over her head. She flinched, but did not resist. It was a surrender born of utter depletion, an act of blind faith. The journey back to the cabin was a brutal fight against the storm. The wind drove the snow into a horizontal fusillade, stinging his eyes and stealing his breath. Each step was a plunge into thigh-deep powder, a lung-burning exertion that sent fire through his muscles. His old knee injury, a souvenir from a hard landing in the Hindu Kush, began to throb with a dull, insistent agony. He gritted his teeth and pushed on, his focus narrowed to the task at hand. He held one arm protectively over the precious cargo inside his jacket, while his other hand held the rope, guiding the staggering, sightless dog behind him. She stumbled often, her paws sinking into the unforgiving snow, but she never stopped. She followed the gentle, steady pressure of the rope, a lifeline in her world of darkness. She followed his scent. She trusted him. At one point, a particularly vicious gust of wind tore at his jacket, threatening to expose the puppies. Elias instinctively reached into an inner pocket and pulled out a soft woolen object. It was Sarah's scarf, the lavender one. He hadn't even realized he'd put it in his pocket that morning. It was just a habit, a talisman he carried. Without a second thought, he used it to shield the opening of his jacket, tucking it around the precious lives huddled within. The faint scent of her, of home and warmth and a life he thought was lost forever, filled his senses. It was a ghost from the past, now being used to protect a fragile future. The irony was a sharp pang in his chest, a pain far deeper than the cold. Finally, the dark silhouette of the cabin emerged from the swirling white. He practically fell through the door, slamming it shut against the raging storm. The sudden silence was deafening. He leaned against the heavy wood, his chest heaving. The warmth of the cabin's interior, a blissful shock to his system. He carefully unzipped his parka. The two puppies tumbled out onto the rug before the cold hearth, blinking in the dim light. Tank, the bold one, immediately tried to stand and fell over his own paws. Ghost, the quiet one, scurried to the darkest corner under a nearby table. Elias then turned to the mother. He removed the rope and she collapsed onto the floor, her body one long, exhausted shiver. The sterile order of his fortress had been breached. Mud, snow, and the scent of wet dog now filled the air. Life, in all its messy, unpredictable glory, had invaded his solitude. For a man who lived by regimen and control, the next few hours were a descent into managed chaos. Elias moved with the focused intensity of a field medic. He stoked the fire in the hearth until it roared, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. He laid out his thickest wool blanket near the flames, creating a soft nest. He gently lifted Grace and settled her onto it, her sigh of relief a gust of warm air against his hand. He then turned his attention to the puppies, drying their damp fur with a rough towel until they were fluffy and warm. He brought them to their mother, and they immediately began to nurse, their tiny bodies squirming with renewed energy. He rummaged through his pantry, his supplies consisting of canned goods, dried meat, and coffee, food for survival, not for nurturing. He found a can of chicken broth and heated it on the wood stove, pouring the warm liquid into a shallow bowl. He placed it near Grace's nose. She sniffed it tentatively at first, then began to lap at it with a desperate thirst. He watched her, a knot tightening in his throat. He ran a hand over her back, feeling the sharp ridges of her spine and ribs beneath her thick coat. She was starving, but she was a survivor. He examined her eyes more closely in the firelight. The cloudiness was deep in the lens, the milky cataract of old blindness, not a recent injury. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This dog had navigated the wilderness, hunted, and cared for her pups, all while living in a world of perpetual night. Her resilience was staggering, a quiet rebuke to his own self-pity. The puppies, their bellies full, began to explore their new territory. Tank was a miniature wrecking ball, tumbling over Elias's neatly placed boots, sniffing curiously at the leg of a chair, and attempting a clumsy pounce on a stray wood chip. Ghost, true to her name, remained in the shadows, a silent observer with wide, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She watched Elias with a cautious intensity that felt deeply familiar, the wary appraisal of a fellow survivor. He found himself watching them, a strange and unfamiliar feeling stirring within him. It was a flicker of warmth in the frozen landscape of his heart, a light he had thought long extinguished. He knew he was out of his depth. His skills were in ballistics and tactical entries, not veterinary care. He picked up his satellite phone, a device he used only for emergencies or the weekly perfunctory check-in with his sister. He dialed her number. Her voice, when she answered, was warm and bright, a stark contrast to the gruff monosyllables he offered in return. "Eris, it's me." There was a pause. "Elias? Is everything okay? The storm?" "Fine," he cut in. "I have a situation. Dogs." Another pause, this one filled with surprise. "Dogs? Plural?" "3," he said, his voice flat. "A mother and 2 pups. Mother's in bad shape. Blind." He could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the veterinarian in her taking over. "Elias, stay put. I'll get there as soon as the roads are passable. Keep them warm and hydrated. Broth is good. Don't try to give them solid food yet." "Roger that," he said, and ended the call. The next day, the storm broke, leaving behind a world of pristine, sculpted white under a brilliant blue sky. Eris arrived in her durable 4-wheel drive truck, her arms full of medical bags and blankets. She swept into the cabin like a spring thaw, her vibrant energy immediately altering the solemn atmosphere. She was younger than Elias by 10 years, with the same dark hair but with eyes that held a compassionate light instead of his haunted shadows. She took in the scene, the dogs nestled by the fire, her formidable brother looking utterly bewildered, and a small smile touched her lips. "Well," she said softly, "looks like you've been busy." She went to work with a gentle competence that Elias admired. She examined Grace first, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice. "Oh, you poor, brave girl," she whispered, checking her vitals, feeling for injuries. "You're safe now." She confirmed his diagnosis. The blindness was chronic, and Grace was severely malnourished, but otherwise strong. She gave her a vitamin injection and cleaned a few minor cuts on her paws. She then turned to the puppies, declaring them underweight but remarkably healthy, a testament to their mother's incredible care. As Eris worked, she noticed the lavender scarf, now dry and draped over the arm of a chair. She picked it up, her expression softening. "You used Sarah's scarf to keep them warm, didn't you?" It wasn't an accusation, but a quiet statement of fact. Elias didn't look at her. He just stared into the fire, his jaw tight. He didn't need to answer. His silence was a confession, an admission that a part of his past he had tried to bury was still alive, still capable of offering comfort. Eris didn't press him. She simply folded the scarf neatly and placed it on the mantelpiece, a splash of color in the monochrome room. That night, Elias refused to sleep in his cot. He told himself it was to keep an eye on Grace, to make sure the fire didn't die down. He settled into the worn leather armchair, a rifle resting near his feet, a sentry on duty. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping dogs. He must have drifted off because he was startled awake by a gentle pressure against his hand, which was dangling over the arm of the chair. He looked down. It was Grace. She had risen and moved silently to his side. She rested her great head on his knee and then nudged his hand with her cold, wet nose. It wasn't a plea for food or a demand for attention. It was a simple, profound gesture of trust. In her darkness, she had learned his scent, the sound of his voice, the rhythm of his breathing. He was her anchor, her guide. He slowly, hesitantly, rested his hand on her head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur of her neck. He felt the steady, reassuring beat of her pulse. A wall inside him, a barrier of ice and grief built over years, began to melt. The tentative peace of the cabin was shattered 2 days later. The news of his rescue had trickled down the mountain, passed along by the local mail carrier who had seen Eris's truck. Martha, the kind-eyed woman who ran the town's general store and seemed to know everything that happened within a 50-mile radius, had called to give him a gentle warning. Someone, a well-meaning neighbor, had reported a stray dog with pups on the mountain. The county's animal control had been notified. Elias felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. His fortress was about to be besieged, not by an enemy he could fight, but by one he couldn't. Bureaucracy. A day later, a county vehicle made the difficult journey up his winding, snow-packed driveway. The man who stepped out was named Henderson. He was of middling height and build, his face etched with the weary patience of someone who spent his days dealing with the sad and complicated intersections of human and animal lives. He was not an antagonist, he was simply an agent of a system, a man with a rulebook. He stood on Elias's porch, his breath pluming in the frigid air, and explained the situation with a tired but firm politeness. "Mr. Thorne, I understand you took in a dog and her litter," Henderson began, his eyes glancing past Elias into the warm interior of the cabin, where Tank was currently engaged in a losing battle with a throw rug. "I appreciate what you did, truly. You saved their lives. But by law, any animal found without an owner has to be brought into the county shelter." Elias's posture, already rigid, became like granite. "They have an owner," he stated, his voice flat and hard. Henderson sighed. "Sir, I understand you've grown attached, but there's a protocol. They have to undergo a mandatory 10-day stray hold, in case an owner comes forward. After that, they'll be vetted, spayed, and put up for adoption." The word adoption landed like a blow. Elias pictured it instantly. Grace, blind and terrified, in a loud, sterile kennel. The puppies, separated from their mother and each other, handed off to strangers. The small, fragile family he had pulled from the jaws of the storm, shattered by a regulation. The protective instinct that had been dormant for so long now roared to life, a white-hot fury. "No," he said. The word was not a negotiation, it was a command. Henderson's expression hardened slightly. "It's not a request, Mr. Thorne. It's the law. I'm trying to be reasonable here. I'll give you 48 hours to get your affairs in order, to say your goodbyes. But then I have to take them. It's my job." A ticking clock had been placed on his newfound peace. 48 hours. The number echoed in the silent cabin long after Henderson's truck had departed. Elias looked at the scene before him. Grace was dozing by the fire, her body finally relaxed in a state of deep sleep. Ghost, no, he was Shadow now, Elias decided, was curled up near her, a small, dark copy of his mother. And Tank was relentlessly trying to get the squeaker out of a toy Eris had brought, his stubby tail wagging with joyous determination. This wasn't a collection of strays. This was a unit, a team. He felt a surge of possessiveness so fierce it startled him. He had spent 2 years pushing the world away, and now he was faced with the one thing he could not, would not, let go. For the first time since he had locked the door on his old life, Elias Thorne had a mission that truly mattered. He looked at Grace, at the absolute trust she placed in him, and the words came to his lips, spoken to the quiet room. "They're not strays," he said, his voice thick with an unfamiliar emotion. "They're family." The 48-hour ultimatum hung over the cabin like a gathering storm cloud, infusing the air with a tense, anxious energy. Elias was a man trained for decisive action, but he found himself paralyzed by the faceless, implacable nature of this new enemy. He couldn't fight a regulation. He couldn't intimidate a piece of paper. He paced the floor, his mind racing through tactical scenarios that were utterly useless. He called Eris, his voice clipped with frustration, explaining the situation. She promised to make some calls to see if there were any exceptions, any loopholes for special circumstances. But her tone was not optimistic. The dog seemed to sense his distress. Grace stayed closer to him than usual, her head often resting on his boot as he stood staring out the window. Shadow watched him from his usual spot in the corner, his small face a mask of concern. Even Tank's playful antics seemed more subdued. The atmosphere of stress was a tangible thing, a low hum of disquiet that set everyone on edge. It was during this period of heightened tension that the mistake happened. Elias had gone out to chop more wood, leaving the cabin door slightly ajar for just a moment as he returned with an armload of logs. It was a momentary lapse in discipline, a tiny seam in his carefully constructed armor, but it was enough. Tank, in a fit of foolish, heroic puppy bravado, spotted a chattering squirrel on a pine branch just outside. For him, it was an irresistible challenge. With a happy yip, he shot through the open door, a furry brown and black missile disappearing into the dense woods that bordered the property. Ghost let out a sharp, piercing whine. Grace instantly scrambled to her feet, her sightless eyes wide with panic. She began to pace frantically, bumping into the table, the chairs, her head swinging from side to side as she sniffed the air, trying to locate the scent of her missing pup. Her helplessness was agonizing to watch. The world outside her immediate circle of scent and sound was a terrifying void, and one of her children had just vanished into it. Elias dropped the firewood with a deafening clatter. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the sky. The brilliant blue of the morning had been replaced by a bruised, heavy gray. The wind was picking up, carrying the unmistakable scent of more snow. Another front was moving in, fast and unforgiving. There was no hesitation. The man of ice and discipline was gone, replaced by a protector driven by pure, raw instinct. He grabbed his parka, his search pack, and a high-powered flashlight, his movements economical and swift. "I'll get him, Grace," he promised, his hand briefly stroking her trembling head. "I'll bring him back." He plunged into the woods, the familiar crunch of his boots on snow now a frantic, desperate rhythm. The pain in his knee, a constant low-grade companion, flared into a sharp, stabbing agony with his first few running steps, but he shoved it down, compartmentalizing it, as he had been trained to do. Pain was just data. The mission was everything. The rescue was a desperate race against the encroaching storm and the fading light. Tiny paw prints were his only guide, a fragile trail being steadily erased by the wind and the first fat flakes of snow that had begun to fall. He called the puppy's name, his voice hoarse and raw against the rising howl of the wind. "Tank, come on, boy." The forest, usually his sanctuary of silence, felt menacing now, its shadows deepening, its trees closing in around him. He pushed himself harder, ignoring the fire in his lungs and the screaming protest of his knee. He remembered another search, another frantic race against time, the smell of dust and cordite in the air, calling for Rex, his voice cracking with a hope he knew was already lost. He shook the memory away. This would not be a repeat. He would not fail again. He finally found him, not by sight, but by sound. A faint, terrified whimpering led him to the edge of a small, steep ravine, hidden by snow-laden brush. He peered over the edge. 10 feet below, on a narrow ledge, was Tank. The little explorer had tumbled in and was now trapped, shivering violently, his bravado completely gone. Elias assessed the situation. The slope was icy and unstable, a treacherous mix of rock and frozen earth. It was a risky climb, especially with his bad knee. He didn't waste a second debating it. He secured a rope to the base of a thick pine and began his descent, the rough fibers biting into his gloved hands. He reached the bottom and scooped the trembling puppy into his arms, tucking him securely inside his parka. "Gotcha, you little fool," he murmured, his voice a mixture of relief and exasperation. The climb back up was grueling. With only one free hand, he had to haul himself and the dead weight of the puppy up the icy incline. His knee gave way once, sending a blinding bolt of pain up his leg, and he dangled precariously from the rope, his teeth gritted against a scream. He found a new foothold and continued, his muscles burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As he finally hauled himself over the lip of the ravine, exhausted and covered in snow, a figure emerged from the swirling blizzard. It was Henderson. The animal control officer had driven back up, his conscience apparently getting the better of him, to see if he could reason with the stubborn ex-soldier. Instead, he found a scene of staggering, desperate devotion. He saw Elias, a man clearly in agony, risking his life in a blizzard for a 10-pound puppy. He saw the fierce, unyielding love in the man's eyes as he clutched the small animal to his chest. The rulebook, the regulations, the protocols, they all seemed utterly meaningless in the face of such a raw and powerful truth. Henderson rushed forward without a word and helped him the rest of the way. When they stumbled back into the warmth of the cabin, the reunion was immediate and emotional. Grace, who had been whining miserably by the door, erupted in a frenzy of happy yips and licks as Elias released Tank onto the floor. She nudged and cleaned him from head to toe, a frantic maternal energy pouring out of her. Shadow emerged from his corner and touched noses with his brother. A quiet welcome home. Elias collapsed into his armchair, his entire body screaming in protest, but his eyes never left the reunited family. Henderson stood in the doorway, water dripping from his hat, a silent witness to the profound bond that filled the small room. The law versus the heart. There was no contest. "I think," Henderson said, his voice quiet but decisive, "I can probably lose some paperwork on my way back down the mountain. You just keep them safe, Mr. Thorne." He had arrived as an agent of the system, but he left as an ally. The siege was over. With the institutional threat gone, a profound and lasting peace settled over the cabin. It was no longer a fortress or a barracks. It was, in the truest sense of the word, a home. The sterile silence was replaced by the happy sounds of life, the gentle thud of Tank's tail against the floorboards, the soft snores from Grace as she dreamt by the fire, the quiet patter of Shadow's paws as he followed Elias from room to room. The rigid order Elias had once imposed on his surroundings gave way to a comfortable, lived-in chaos. Dog toys littered the floor, a water bowl was permanently stationed by the stove, and his once immaculate wool blanket was now covered in a fine layer of German shepherd fur. A new routine emerged, one not of defense, but of caregiving. Mornings began not with a solitary, punishing workout, but with letting the dogs out into the crisp mountain air, their joyful barks echoing in the valley. Elias found a new purpose in the simple, grounding tasks of feeding them, brushing their thick coats, and tending to their needs. He built a large, sturdy enclosure in the yard, a place where they could play safely, his hands rediscovering a forgotten satisfaction in the act of building something to protect, rather than to repel. His life, once a straight, unbending line, now had rhythm and texture. His small, isolated world began to expand. Iris became a regular visitor, bringing veterinary supplies, and more importantly, her warm, grounding presence. She would sit at his table, sipping coffee while the puppies vied for her attention, and they would talk, really talk, for the first time in years. He told her about Rex, about the searing guilt he carried. She listened, her compassion a healing balm on his old wounds. Martha from the general store would make the trip up the mountain once a week, her car loaded with bags of premium dog food and containers of her famous beef stew for him. She would sit by the fire, watching him interact with the dogs, a knowing smile on her face. "A good man needs a mission," she told him once. "Looks like you found a new one." He did. He spoke with Henderson on the phone, and their conversations shifted from adversarial to collaborative. They talked about the lack of resources for animals in their remote corner of the county, the overflowing shelter, the need for a place that could handle cases like Grace's. A seed was planted in Elias's mind, the blueprint for a new mission, one that would honor the memory of Rex and give meaning to his own survival. He wasn't just a dog owner, he was becoming an advocate, a rescuer. Spring arrived, slowly at first, then in a glorious rush of life. The heavy mantle of snow receded, revealing the sleeping earth beneath. Patches of green appeared on the forest floor, and the icy streams began to flow freely once more. The internal winter in Elias's soul thawed in tandem with the world outside. One warm afternoon, he sat on his porch, watching the puppies, now lanky adolescents, wrestling on the new grass. Tank was still a clumsy oaf, and Shadow was still a quiet, watchful soul. But they were healthy and happy. Grace lay at his feet, her head resting on his boot, her body relaxed in the warm sun. She was his anchor, his guide out of the darkness. He reached into the cabin and retrieved a small wooden box from the mantelpiece. Inside was an old harmonica, something he hadn't touched since Sarah was alive. They used to sit on this very porch, and he would play simple, heartfelt tunes while she read. The music had died with her. He brought the harmonica to his lips, his movements hesitant at first. He blew a single, clear note that hung in the still air. Grace's ears twitched. He began to play, a soft, simple melody that spoke not of the crushing grief he once felt, but of a quiet, resilient joy. It was a song of survival, of second chances, of a family found in the most unexpected of circumstances. As he played, he looked out at the majestic peaks, at the vibrant life teeming in his yard, and for the first time in a long, long time, Elias Thorne smiled. He was a wounded warrior who had been called to rescue the vulnerable, and in doing so had found himself and his own heart rescued in return.